Want me? Go chew it like a dog outside, my son said, and the laughter that followed told me everything I needed to know. I stood there for a moment, the smell of grilled steak still hanging in the warm Sunday air, the kind of late afternoon where the sun sits low and golden over the backyard, where neighbors lean over fences with plastic cups and easy smiles, where families are supposed to look whole. My hand was still holding the paper plate he had just knocked from my grip, the flimsy edge bent slightly, where my fingers tightened without me realizing. The steak lay on the ground near his shoes, juices soaking into the grass we had watered together for years, back when this house still felt like mine. No one rushed to pick it up. No one said my name. I looked around at the faces I had known for decades, people who had eaten at my table, borrowed my tools, asked me for recipes and advice, and every single one of them avoided my eyes as if silence could erase what had just happened. I nodded once, more to myself than to anyone else, and set the empty plate down on the patio table with a soft, careful motion. I didn't ask them why. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give them the scene they were waiting for. Instead, I reached for my purse, brushed an invisible speck of dust from my sleeve, and walked toward the side gate as if I had simply remembered something I needed to do. Behind me, the music picked back up, low and cheerful, and someone made a joke that drew a ripple of laughter, light and effortless, like nothing had happened at all. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I stepped out onto the driveway, and for the first time that afternoon, I let myself take a full breath. It tasted different out there, quieter, cooler, untouched by whatever had just shifted inside that backyard. I paused beside my car, one hand resting on the door handle, and for a brief second, I thought about all the Sundays that had come before this one. The ones where I woke up early to marinate meat, to set out chairs, to make sure there was enough for everyone. The ones where Daniel used to stand beside me at the grill, asking if the temperature was right, laughing when he got it wrong. The ones where Jessica would compliment the way I seasoned the food, her voice sweet and careful, her smile just warm enough to pass for genuine. I had believed those moments meant something. I had believed that consistency, that effort, that quiet kind of love built over time would anchor a family in place. But standing there in my own driveway, I realized something else had been building, something quieter, sharper, and far more deliberate. And somehow I had missed it, or maybe I had chosen not to see it. I opened the car door slowly and slid into the driver's seat, placing my purse neatly on the passenger side, as if I were heading to the grocery store, as if this were just another ordinary errand. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady, patient. In the rearview mirror, I could still see the edge of the backyard, the flicker of movement, the life of a gathering I was no longer part of. I didn't feel the urge to go back. I didn't feel the need to defend myself or demand respect. What I felt was something colder, clearer, something that settled into place with a quiet certainty. I had spent years making sure everyone else had what they needed. Today, I finally understood what that had cost me. And as I turned the key in the ignition, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, because if that was how they chose to treat me in front of the world, then they had just made their first mistake. I drove for a while without turning on the radio, letting the quiet settle in around me the way it used to on early mornings before the house woke up, back when the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the hardwood floors as I moved through rooms that felt full of purpose. And as the road stretched ahead in long, familiar lines, I realized I was not going anywhere in particular, just putting distance between myself and that backyard, between myself and the version of my life that had just been exposed for what it truly was. And when I finally pulled into my driveway, the same driveway I had parked in for over 30 years, I sat there for a moment with the engine still running, staring at the front of the house, noticing details I had stopped seeing long ago, the paint that needed touching up, the porch light that flickered if you did not tighten the bulb just right, the flower beds I had planted myself every spring without fail. And for the first time, I saw it not as a place of comfort, but as something I had been maintaining for everyone else, something that had slowly shifted out of my control without me realizing it. And when I stepped inside, the air felt still, almost too still, as if the walls themselves were waiting for me to catch up to a truth they had been holding for years. and I set my purse down in its usual spot, lined up perfectly on the console table, because I've always believed that order in small things helps keep the rest of life from unraveling, even when everything else feels uncertain. And I walked into the kitchen, instinctively reaching for a glass, filling it with water, taking a slow sip, grounding myself in something simple, something real. And that is when the memories began to rearrange themselves, not as separate moments, but as pieces of a pattern I could no longer ignore. Daniel avoiding conversations about the house, brushing off my questions with a casual tone that used to comfort me, but now felt rehearsed. Jessica stepping in to answer for him, her voice always polite, always measured, but somehow always final. The way she had started organizing things without asking, moving items from one room to another, suggesting changes that did not feel like suggestions at all, and how I had told myself it was just her way of helping, her way of contributing, because that is what you do when you want peace. You explain away what does not sit right. You soften the edges of discomfort until it feels almost acceptable. And I thought about the small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. The time my bedroom door had been left open and a box of old documents had been moved. The time Daniel mentioned property taxes in a tone that felt less like concern and more like calculation. The time Jessica asked me if I had ever considered something smaller, something easier to manage. Her smile gentle, her words careful, but her eyes already measuring the space around her and standing there in my own kitchen. I realized those were not isolated incidents. They were steps, quiet, deliberate steps towards something I had not wanted to name, and I set the glass down slowly, the sound of it touching the counter louder than it should have been, and I let the silence fill the room again, not as something empty, but as something clarifying. And for the first time since Daniel had spoken those words in the backyard, I allowed myself to see him not as the little boy who used to reach for my hand, but as the man who had just chosen to humiliate me in front of others without hesitation, without regret. And that clarity did not break me. It steadied me. It shifted something inside me into place, something that had been waiting for the moment when denial would no longer be possible. And I walked down the hallway toward the study, the one room that had remained mostly untouched, the room where his father used to sit in. The evenings, going over papers, keeping records in neat, precise stacks, and I paused at the doorway, my hand resting lightly against the frame, because I understood now that whatever came next would not be about reacting to what had been done to me. It would be about understanding what had already been set in motion long before that Sunday afternoon. And I stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind me, not to shut anything out, but to finally begin looking at everything I had ignored for far too long. I stood in that study longer than I expected, letting my eyes adjust to the dimmer light, the curtains still drawn halfway the way he used to leave them, as if he never wanted the room to feel too exposed, and everything inside remained exactly where it had been placed with intention. The desk aligned square with the wall, the leather chair pushed in just enough, the shelves holding years of documents, neatly labeled, dated, preserved, not because he was obsessive, but because he believed that clarity was protection, that if everything was accounted for, nothing could be taken quietly. And I moved slowly toward the desk, running my fingers lightly across the surface, feeling the faint grooves and imperfections that only come from years of use, from nights spent balancing numbers, reviewing statements, making decisions that would outlast him. And for a moment, I could almost hear his voice again, not loud, not commanding, but steady, reminding me to pay attention to what people do when they think no one is watching, because that is where truth reveals itself. And I opened the top drawer carefully, not searching for anything specific, just following a feeling I could not ignore. And inside were folders I'd seen before, but never opened, because I had trusted him to handle it all, trusted that there would always be time to understand later. And now later had arrived, whether I was ready or not. And I pulled one folder out, then another, placing them in a small stack, the weight of them surprising me, not physically, but in what they represented: years of planning, of foresight, of decisions made quietly to protect what we had built. And as I opened the first set of papers, I recognized familiar names, bank accounts, property records, signatures, all precise, all deliberate. And then I saw something that made me pause, a transfer that had been initiated months ago, long before that afternoon in the backyard, a shift in ownership structure that I had never been told about. Not because it was hidden from me, but because I had never thought to look, and I leaned closer, reading each line carefully, my eyes moving slower now, not from confusion, but from the weight of understanding settling in piece by piece, and it became clear that what Daniel and Jessica believed they had access to was not what it appeared to be, that the house, the accounts, the assets they had been circling around were no longer positioned the way they assumed, and I felt something steady rise within me. Not anger, not even hurt, but something far more controlled, a quiet awareness that the balance of this situation was not what they thought it was, and I set the papers down gently, aligning them again as they had been, respecting the order he had left behind, because now I understood that this was not just organization, this was preparation, and I moved to the bookshelf, scanning the labels more intentionally this time, noticing how certain folders were grouped together, how dates lined up with events I could now recall, conversations that had seemed casual but were clearly not. And I pulled down another file, this one thinner, marked only with a date from the year before he passed, and inside was a letter, written in his handwriting, addressed to me, not in a dramatic way, not sealed or hidden, just placed where he knew I would eventually find it when I was ready to see what I had been avoiding, and I did not rush to open it. Instead, I held it for a moment, feeling the paper between my fingers, grounding myself in the reality that whatever came next was not something I needed to fear, because for the first time since that Sunday afternoon, I was no longer reacting to their behavior. I was beginning to understand the structure beneath it, the framework that had been quietly protecting me all along, and I walked back to the desk, sat down in his chair, and placed the letter in front of me, my hands steady, my thoughts clear, knowing that the story I had been living in until now was only one version of the truth, and that version was about to change. I opened the letter slowly, not because my hands were shaking, but because I understood that whatever was written there had been left with intention, and intention deserved patience. And the paper made a soft, familiar sound as it unfolded, the kind of sound that belongs to something important but not urgent, something meant to be read carefully. And his handwriting was exactly as I remembered it, steady, deliberate. Each letter formed with the same quiet discipline he brought to everything he did. And the first line was simple, almost disarmingly so. Not dramatic, not heavy, just a greeting that felt like he was sitting across from me again, speaking in that calm tone that never rushed ahead of itself. And as I read further, the room seemed to settle into a deeper stillness, as if even the walls were listening, and he did not write about love in the way people expect. There were no grand declarations, no sentimental phrases, just a clear acknowledgement of the life we had built together, the decisions we had made, and the understanding that time changes people in ways that are not always visible at first. And then he shifted, gently but firmly, into something else, something that felt less like a memory and more like a warning, not a fearful one, but a measured one, the kind that comes from observation rather than suspicion. And he wrote about patterns, about how people reveal themselves through small, repeated choices, through what they prioritize when they believe no one is keeping track. And as I continued reading, I began to recognize the moments he was referring to, not directly, but through the way he described them, the subtle shifts in tone, the gradual distancing, the conversations that seemed harmless on the surface but carried a different weight underneath. And it became clear that he had seen what I had chosen to overlook, not because I was incapable, but because I had wanted harmony more than clarity, and he did not blame me for that. He simply acknowledged it. And then he explained what he had done, not in detail at first, but enough for me to understand that he had taken steps, quiet, precise steps to ensure that what we had built could not be easily taken apart by assumption or entitlement. And I felt my chest tighten slightly, not with fear, but with the realization that he had been preparing for something I had refused to consider. And yet he never made me feel unprepared. He had simply left the pieces where I could find them when I was ready to see the whole picture. And I read the letter again, slower this time, letting each sentence settle fully, noticing how there was no urgency in his words, only certainty, as if he knew that understanding would come in its own time. And when I finally reached the end, there was no dramatic conclusion, No instruction demanding immediate action. Just a quiet reminder that clarity is not something you're given. It is something you allow yourself to accept. And I folded the letter carefully, placing it back on the desk for a moment, my fingers resting lightly on the paper. And I looked around the study again, but this time everything felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I was no longer looking at it through the same lens. I could see the structure now, the intention behind the organization, the way everything connected in a way that protected rather than exposed. And I stood up slowly, moving back toward the folders I'd set aside, this time not as someone searching for answers, but as someone ready to confirm what she already understood, and one by one, I began to open them again, aligning the information with what I had just read, seeing the adjustments, the safeguards, the quiet redirections of ownership and control. And it was all there, not hidden, not complicated, just precise. And for the first time since that moment in the backyard, I felt something settle into place completely. Not anger, not sadness, but control, the kind that does not need to be announced, the kind that exists whether anyone else recognizes it or not. And I closed the final folder, placing it back exactly where it belonged, because now I knew that what Daniel and Jessica believed they were moving toward was not what they would find when they arrived. And as I turned off the light in the study and stepped back into the hallway, I carried that understanding with me, not as a burden, but as something far more powerful, something that did not need to be rushed. Because the truth, once seen clearly, does not require noise to make itself known. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a quiet shift in the light through the kitchen window, the kind that does not ask permission before revealing what is already there, and I moved through my usual routine with the same steady pace, making coffee, setting a single cup on the counter, the sound of the machine filling the silence in a way that felt almost deliberate, and I sat down at the table, not out of habit, but out of intention, because for the first time in a long while I was not filling space, I was observing it. And as I took a slow sip, I replayed the events of the day before, not the humiliation itself, but the details around it, the way Jessica had positioned herself near the center of the gathering, greeting people before I had the chance, the way Daniel had kept his distance from me even before that moment, his tone already different, lighter with others, heavier when directed at me. And I remembered something else, something small that it seemed insignificant at the time, the way Jessica had mentioned, almost casually, that they had been looking into options, her words vague, her smile polite, and I had nodded without asking what she meant because I had learned that asking questions often led to answers that were carefully shaped rather than honestly given. And now, sitting there with the letter still fresh in my mind, I understood that those options were not possibilities, they were plans. And plans have structure, they have timelines, they have expectations, and more importantly, they rely on assumptions. And the assumption they were relying on was that I would remain exactly as I had always been, agreeable, accommodating, willing to step aside if it made things easier for everyone else. And I set the cup down gently, the porcelain touching the wood with a soft, controlled sound, and I allowed myself to consider what would happen if I did exactly what they expected, if I continued to nod, to remain silent, to let them believe that everything was unfolding according to their design. And the thought did not feel like surrender. It felt like alignment, not with them, but with something far more precise. And I stood up, moving to the counter where my phone rested, untouched since the day before. And I picked it up, scrolling briefly before selecting a number I had not called in some time. Not because it was unimportant, but because it had not been necessary until now. And when the call connected, I spoke in the same calm tone I had used for years, steady, measured, asking for an appointment, not urgent, not emotional, just a simple request to review documents, to clarify details, to confirm what I already understood. And the voice on the other end responded with familiarity, with respect, scheduling a time later that afternoon. And I thanked them, ending the call without hesitation, and I placed the phone back exactly where it had been, not as a return to routine, but as a marker, a small, quiet step that shifted the direction of everything that would follow. And I moved through the rest of the morning with that same sense of clarity, not rushing, not hesitating, simply allowing each action to follow the next with purpose. And when I passed the window, I noticed the backyard again, now empty, The chairs still slightly out of place, the grill covered but not cleaned, remnants of a gathering that had already begun to fade, and I did not feel the urge to restore it, to reset it for the next event, because I understood now that what needed to change was not the arrangement of furniture, but the structure of expectation. And as I turned away from the window, I carried that understanding with me. Not as something heavy, but as something steady, something that did not need to be announced or explained, because the most significant shifts rarely make noise. They simply alter the outcome long before anyone else realizes the direction has changed. The afternoon air felt different when I stepped outside again. Not warmer or cooler, just clearer, as if the edges of everything had sharpened in a way I had not noticed before, and I drove to the appointment without rushing, following the same route I had taken countless times over the years, passing the same grocery store, the same gas station, the same row of trees that always leaned slightly toward the road. And yet none of it felt routine anymore, because I was not the same person moving through it. And when I arrived, I parked in the same spot I had used before, second space from the entrance, close enough to be convenient, far enough to avoid attention, and I turned off the engine, taking a moment to sit in the quiet, not to gather courage, but to acknowledge that this step was not reactive, it was deliberate, and I walked inside with the same steady pace I had maintained all morning, greeting the receptionist with a small nod, my voice calm as I confirmed my name, and I was led into a familiar office, one that still held the same arrangement of chairs, the same framed certificates on the wall, the same sense of order that mirrored the study at home. And when he entered, he greeted me with recognition, not surprise, as if he had expected this visit at some point, and we sat across from each other, the desk between us not as a barrier, but as a place where clarity could be laid out in plain view. And I placed the folder I had brought with me on the desk, not sliding it forward immediately, just letting it rest there as a quiet signal of purpose. And I spoke without hesitation, asking for confirmation rather than explanation, because I already understood the structure. I only needed to hear acknowledged from someone who had helped put it in place, and he listened carefully, nodding once before opening his own files, aligning them with what I had brought. And as he began to speak, his words were precise, measured, matching the tone of everything I had read the night before, and he explained how the ownership had been adjusted, how certain assets had been repositioned, not removed, not hidden, but secured in a way that prevented them from being assumed or redirected without my consent. And there was no urgency in his explanation, no suggestion that anything needed to be done immediately, because the structure itself was already in place, functioning exactly as it had been designed to. And I listened without interrupting, not because I was uncertain, but because I respected the clarity of the process. And when he finished, I asked one final question, not about what had been done, but about what would happen if others attempted to act on incorrect assumptions. And his answer was simple, almost understated, that actions based on incorrect assumptions tend to reveal themselves quickly, especially when the underlying structure does not support them. And I allowed that to settle, not as reassurance, but as confirmation, and I nodded once, closing the folder gently, aligning it with the edge of the desk before lifting it again, and I thanked him not for fixing anything, but for maintaining something that had already been carefully built. And as I stood to leave, there was no sense of urgency, no need to rush into the next step, because I understood now that timing was not something to be forced, it was something to be observed, and I walked back through the office, past the same receptionist, out into the same afternoon light. And when I reached my car, I paused again, my hand resting lightly on the door, and I looked ahead, not at any specific destination, but at the quiet certainty that had settled into place. Because what Daniel and Jessica believed they were moving toward was already set on a path they did not control. And for the first time since everything had begun to shift, I was not waiting for something to happen. I was allowing it to unfold exactly as it would. I returned home just before sunset, the lights stretching long across the driveway, casting quiet shadows that seemed to settle into every corner of the property. And as I stepped inside, I did not turn on any lights right away, letting the dimness remain for a moment as my eyes adjusted, as if I needed to see the house as it truly was before deciding what it would become. And I set the folder down in the same place I had left it earlier, Not hidden, not displayed, just present, because I understood now that nothing needed to be concealed, only timed, and I moved through the kitchen with the same steady rhythm, preparing a simple dinner for one, not out of habit, but out of clarity, because there was no longer any expectation that the table would be filled, no illusion that I was hosting something that no longer existed. And as I sat down, I allowed the quiet to settle again, not as loneliness, but as control. And it was not long before I heard the front door open, the familiar sound of keys, footsteps, voices entering the space, as if nothing had shifted, as if the previous day had been no more than a passing moment. And Daniel walked in first, his tone casual, almost rehearsed, asking if I'd gotten home safely, as if concern could be offered after the fact and still hold meaning. And Jessica followed, her expression composed, her smile measured, her eyes scanning the room in that subtle way I now recognized, taking in details, assessing, adjusting, and I looked up from the table, meeting their presence without hesitation, without warmth, without resistance, simply acknowledging it. And I answered his question with the same calm tone. Yes, I had. Returned without issue. And I continued eating, not inviting conversation, not avoiding it, just allowing it to exist or not exist on its own. And there was a pause, a small one, but noticeable, the kind that forms when expectations do not align with reality. And Jessica was the first to fill it, her voice light, almost sympathetic, suggesting that perhaps the previous day had been misunderstood, that emotions had run higher than intended, that sometimes things are said in the moment that do not reflect how people truly feel. And I listened without interrupting, not because I believed her, but because I understood the role she was playing. And when she finished, I set my fork down gently, not making a point, just completing the motion, and I looked at them both, not searching for anything, just observing, and I nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, not agreement, not forgiveness, just recognition that words had been spoken. And Daniel shifted slightly, as if expecting more, perhaps a reaction, perhaps a question, something that would allow him to regain a position he no longer held, but I offered nothing beyond that nod. And I returned to my meal, the quiet filling the space again. Heavier now, not uncomfortable, but undeniable. And after a moment, they moved past me into the rest of the house, their voices lowering, their steps slightly quicker, as if they were adjusting to a change they could not yet define. And I finished my dinner at the same pace, placing the dishes in the sink, rinsing them carefully, each movement deliberate, controlled. And when I turned off the faucet, the silence that followed felt complete, not empty, not waiting, just settled, and I dried my hands, glancing briefly toward the hallway where their voices continued, in softer tones. And I understood then that they believed the situation had stabilized, that my lack of reaction signaled acceptance, that the absence of confrontation meant they could proceed as planned, and I allowed that belief to remain untouched because it served a purpose. And I moved toward the living room, sitting in my usual chair, not out of habit, but out of intention, and I let the evening unfold without interference. Because the most effective shifts do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves only when it is too late to adjust. And as the house settled into its nighttime rhythm, I remained exactly where I was, calm, steady, and fully aware that they were moving forward with a plan that no longer belonged to them. The following morning unfolded with the same quiet precision that had settled in the house the night before, but this time there was a subtle shift beneath it, something that moved just beneath the surface, something that could not be seen unless you knew exactly where to look. And I moved through my routine as I always had: coffee, a small breakfast, the newspaper folded neatly beside me. But my attention was not on the headlines or the clock. It was on the rhythm of the house itself, the way footsteps echoed differently when people believed they were in control, the way voices carried when confidence replaced caution. And I heard them before I saw them. Daniel and Jessica speaking in the kitchen, their tones low but not careful, not anymore, because they believed the situation had settled, that whatever resistance might have existed had already passed. And I remained where I was, seated in the living room, not hiding, not listening in, simply present, allowing their words to reach me without effort. And it was Jessica who spoke first, her voice calm, almost satisfied. mentioning timelines, referencing appointments, speaking about the house not as something shared, but as something already transitioning, and Daniel responded with agreement, his tone lighter than it had been in weeks, as if a weight had been lifted simply because he believed the outcome was assured. And I did not interrupt. I did not shift in my seat. I did not make my presence known beyond what already was, because there was no need. The clarity of their intentions was unfolding on its own, piece by piece, confirming what I had already understood. And after a few moments, their voices lowered further, not out of caution, but out of habit, the conversation continuing in fragments that no longer require my full attention, because the pattern was already complete, and I stood up slowly, moving toward the hallway, not to confront, not to question, just to pass through. And as I entered the kitchen, their conversation paused, not abruptly, but noticeably, like a sentence left unfinished, and I acknowledged them with a simple glance, nothing more, no tension, no warmth, just recognition. And I reached for a glass, filling it with water, the sound of it steady, consistent, grounding, and Jessica offered a small smile, the kind that suggests normalcy, the kind that attempts to smooth over what does not need smoothing. And she asked if I planned for the day, her tone casual, but her eyes attentive, measuring, and I answered simply that I did. Nothing more, no detail, no explanation, because information I had learned was something that did not need to be offered freely. And Daniel nodded, as if that answer confirmed something for him, as if it aligned with whatever expectation he had formed. And I finished with the glass, placing it back on the counter with the same care I applied to everything else. And I left the kitchen without hesitation, returning to the living room, but not sitting down this time. Instead, I moved toward the front door, gathering my purse, my keys, each item in its place, each movement deliberate. And as I stepped outside, the air carried that same clarity I had noticed the day before, the kind that does not announce itself, but changes everything it touches. And I drove again, not aimlessly this time, but with direction, not urgency, but purpose, because what needed to happen next was not a reaction. It was a continuation, a quiet alignment of actions with understanding. And when I arrived at my destination, I did not hesitate. I walked inside with the same steady pace, greeted the same familiar faces, and confirmed the next step without explanation, because none was needed. And as the details were finalized, signatures acknowledged, documents reviewed, there was no sense of confrontation, no dramatic shift, just a series of confirmations that solidified what had already been set in motion. And when I left, the weight of uncertainty was no longer present, replaced instead by something far more precise, something that did not need to be expressed to be effective. And as I returned to the car, I allowed myself a brief pause, not to reflect, but to recognize that the distance between what they believed and what was true had grown wider than they could see, and that distance was where everything would unfold, not loudly, not suddenly, but inevitably, exactly as it was meant to. The shift did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, the way most consequences do, wrapped in ordinary moments that feel almost too simple to matter. And that evening, when I returned home, the house carried a different kind of energy, not louder, not tense, just unsettled in a way that suggested something had begun to move beneath the surface. And Daniel was in the living room, standing near the window, his posture rigid in a way I had not seen before, his phone still in his hand as if he had just ended a call that had not gone the way he expected. And Jessica sat on the edge of the sofa, her expression composed but strained at the edges, her usual control slipping just enough to be noticeable. And I stepped inside without hesitation, closing the door behind me with the same quiet precision I had carried through every action over the past few days. And neither of them spoke immediately, not because they were unsure what to say, but because they were recalculating, adjusting to something they did not yet understand. And I placed my purse down, removed my coat, each movement steady, unhurried, and then I looked at them, not with accusation, not with anger, just with the same calm awareness that had guided me this far. And Daniel was the first to speak, his voice lower now, less certain, asking if I had changed anything regarding the house, the accounts, the arrangements, his words careful, but the urgency beneath them unmistakable. I did not answer right away, not to create tension, but because the answer itself did not require emphasis. And when I did speak, my tone matched his calm, measured, clear. I told him that nothing had been changed, only clarified, and that was enough to shift the room, enough to make the silence that followed feel heavier, more defined. And Jessica leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to reveal the calculation behind them, asking what I meant by clarified, and I held her gaze for a moment, not challenging, not yielding, simply allowing the meaning to settle where it needed to. And I explained that what they believed to be accessible, to be transferable, to be theirs to manage had never been structured that way. Not recently, not even before that. And that assumptions, while convenient, do not alter reality. And Daniel took a step back, the weight of that realization beginning to show, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know him, but enough for me to see the shift, the moment when expectation collides with truth. And Jessica's expression tightened, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless. And she asked, more directly this time, what exactly that meant for them. And I answered without hesitation, without emphasis, that it meant nothing had been taken from them, because nothing had been theirs in the first place. And the room settled into a silence that no one rushed to fill, not because there were no words left, but because the ones that mattered had already been spoken. And I did not stay to extend the moment. I did not wait for questions or reactions, because I understood that understanding does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it unfolds slowly, piece by piece, long after the conversation has ended, and I move past them toward the hallway, my steps steady, my posture unchanged, and I paused only briefly, not to look back, but to acknowledge, if only to myself, that the balance had shifted completely, not in a way that needed to be proven, but in a way that could no longer be ignored. And as I continued down the hallway, leaving them behind in that quiet realization, I understood something with absolute clarity, something that did not need to be spoken aloud to hold its full weight. He had thrown my stake onto the ground as if it meant nothing, but in doing so, he had revealed exactly what everything else was worth. And by the time he understood that, there would be nothing left for him to reach for. At a quiet Sunday gathering that should have brought warmth and connection, a mother finds herself publicly humiliated by her own son, while her daughter-in-law watches with calculated silence. What follows is not an outburst, not a confrontation, but a slow and controlled unraveling of everything hidden beneath years of polite smiles and unspoken tension. This story explores the emotional depth and quiet strength often found in family stories, where a woman who spent decades building a home begins to see how easily she has been pushed to the margins of her own life. As subtle patterns emerge and long, ignored details come into focus, the mother realizes that what seemed like small changes were part of a larger plan driven by entitlement and quiet manipulation. Through calm observation and deliberate action, she begins to reclaim control, showing that in the world of family stories, power does not always belong to those who speak the loudest. Instead, it often rests with those who understand the full picture before making a move. As the son and daughter-in-law move forward with assumptions about ownership and authority, they unknowingly step into a reality they never fully understood. This narrative highlights how family stories can reveal the hidden dynamics of respect, control, and consequence, especially when silence is mistaken for weakness. With each step, the mother shifts from being overlooked to becoming the one who defines the outcome, demonstrating that true strength in family stories lies in patience, clarity, and timing. In the end, this is not just a story of betrayal, but a powerful reminder that even the most carefully laid plans can collapse when built on false assumptions, making this one of those unforgettable family stories where dignity is restored without raising a voice. Character 1. A 71-year-old white woman with silver hair styled neatly and soft blue eyes. She wears a modest, elegant beige cardigan and simple blouse. Front-facing portrait, natural lighting, realistic skin texture. No cartoon, no cartoon. No selfie, no illustration. Character 2. A 42-year-old white man with short dark hair and sharp features. He wears a casual fitted polo shirt and jeans. Front-facing portrait. Neutral expression. Realistic skin texture. No cartoon, no cartoon. No selfie. No illustration.